Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I want to start somewhere a little bit different, not with Washington or Congress or the latest political scandal. I want to start with a question. Who gets to define America? Because if we zoom out, we look at everything happening right now, the elections, the court cases, the protests, the education battles, the fight over government power in general, it's all connected. And it comes back to the idea of who are we? Who gets a voice? Who gets power? And who gets to make sure that nobody gets too much of it? Over the last several years, we've heard a lot of people claim ownership over what America's supposed to be. But America one ideology, and that's where I want to begin. America has always been complicated. It's factory workers, it's engineers, it's farmers, teachers, immigrants, descendants of immigrants, people of different religions, different cultures, different political beliefs. The strength of our country has never been that everyone agrees. The strength of our country has always been that people who disagree still participate in the same democratic system. And that's the American experiment right there, not uniformity, pluralism. And lately, you're seeing more people push back against the idea that America belongs to one political tribe because it doesn't. People are showing up, we're organizing, voting, running for office, speaking out, not because we all agree with each other, but because we believe our voices matter. And that belief is becoming increasingly important as we head into the 2026 midterms. A lot of elections get framed around individual issues: inflation, immigration, taxes, healthcare. All of these things matter. But underneath these policy debates is something larger: trust. Do Americans trust elections? Do we trust the courts? Do we trust public institutions? Do we trust that power will remain constrained no matter who wins? I know that right now, those are hard things to put trust into. These are questions that sit underneath almost every major political debate happening right now. The 2026 midterms aren't simply about which party wins a few more seats. They're becoming more of a referendum on how Americans feel about the health of our democratic institutions. And what makes this interesting is that that concern isn't making people disengage. It's doing quite the opposite. The closer we get to elections, the more civic engagement we're seeing, not less, but more. Because people are increasingly starting to feel like what happens next really matters. And that's one of the most important developments in the country right now. People are paying attention. We're attending town halls, we're following local elections, requesting public records, volunteering, organizing, showing up. One of the oldest lessons in democratic history is that institutions become stronger when citizens stay engaged. The opposite is also true. When people stop paying attention, power becomes easier to concentrate. That's why civic engagement matters. And increasingly, that engagement is showing up in another place, and that's the courts. One recent case involving protesters near the detention facility became an important reminder on how checks and balances are supposed to work. So, federal prosecutors advanced a broad conspiracy theory involving multiple defendants. Ultimately, these cases fell apart. Judges challenged the government's approach, and that is all significant, not because every court decision is perfect, but because independent courts remain one of the primary ways democratic systems prevent power from becoming unchecked. The founders intentionally built friction into the system for these reasons. Sometimes that friction can be frustrating. It's also protective. And while that case ended with limits on government authority, other cases are raising entirely different questions. So there's been federal authorities recently announced indictments connected to anti-ICE demonstrations in Minneapolis. The details of the case will ultimately be decided in court, but the broader question already matters. Where's the line between criminal conduct and political dissent? How should governments respond to protest movements? How do democratic socialists maintain order while also protecting civil liberties? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're really important questions. And when multiple cases begin raising similar concerns, people naturally start looking at the bigger picture. Now, over the past years, we've seen broader debates emerge around surveillance, around protest activity, detention policies. And, for many, the concern isn't any single policy, it's the overall direction we're headed. History shows that democratic societies remain healthy when institutions are transparent, accountable, and willing to accept limits on their own authority. Whenever power expands, citizens tend to ask the same questions. What safeguards exist? What or who provides oversight? Who makes sure those powers aren't abused? These questions aren't partisan, they're foundational because government power isn't judged only by what it can do, it's judged by the limits that we place upon it. At the same time, there's another challenge facing every administration, and that's competence. Political power ultimately depends on performance. It's one of the it's one thing to announce major initiatives, but it's another thing to execute them successfully. We don't see that in this administration, and voters notice that difference. People care about results, people care about projects being delivered, promises being fulfilled. And these questions are another sort of political messaging because at the end of the day, people experience government through outcomes. And some of the most important outcomes right now are being influenced by events happening beyond America's broader borders. And that's where foreign policy becomes personal, where we feel it. When people hear about tensions involving Iran or the Strait of Hormuz, it can feel distant, but it's not. A significant portion of the world's energy supply moves through that region. And when instability increases there, energy markets feel it. We feel it here. Energy costs rise, transportation costs rise, goods become more expensive, food becomes more expensive, housing becomes more expensive. The ripple effect really spreads throughout the economy. And that's why events thousands of miles away eventually show up in our household budgets. We feel it. And while Americans are thinking about costs, we're also thinking about fairness. One of the strongest expectations that Americans have is that rules should apply to everybody equally. Rich or poor, powerful, powerless, Republican, Democrat. People may disagree about outcomes, but most agree that fairness matters. Whenever America begins questioning whether different rules exist for different groups, trust in institutions starts to weaken, and trust is increasingly difficult to rebuild once it's lost. Those same concerns about trust are appearing in another area that receives far less public attention, and that's scientific research. So, research funding rarely dominates political headlines. Yes, it shapes enormous portions of modern life, whether that's through medical breakthroughs, whether that's through technological innovation, drug development, scientific discovery. I mean, historically, experts evaluated scientific proposals based on evidence and expertise. Today, there are growing debates about how much influence politics should have over those decisions. Because if research priorities become political priorities, the consequences extend well beyond universities. They affect medicine, technology, economic competitiveness. and honestly, just America's ability to innovate in general. The same debate over expertise in public investment also appears in education. So, school vouchers have become one of the most significant education debates in this country. Supporters see choice, opponents see risk to education, but beneath the policy arguments, there's a larger question. So, what responsibilities should public institutions carry? Public schools serve every student who walks through the door, student with disabilities, students requiring additional support, students facing difficult circumstances. That obligation is part of what makes public education unique. Once that conversation begins, it naturally leads to another question. What role should the federal government play in education at all? And that debate, it's been building for years. There's some who believe education decisions should primarily belong to states and local communities, or federal oversight should provide important protections and ensure equal access. This debate, it stretches across American history, federal authority versus local authority, national standards versus local control. Education simply happens to be one of today's most visible battlegrounds. But for many families, there aren't the abstract policy discussions. These are really deeply personal discussions that are happening that really affect them. Now, nowhere is there the more obvious focus than in special education. So millions of families rely on protections, on funding structures, on oversight systems that have been built over decades. When discussions about restructuring education occur, parents immediately start beginning asking to, they start to have practical questions. Who protects these rights? Who enforces these standards? Who ensures that these services remain available? Who steps in when problems arise? These questions matter because they're affecting real people, real children, real families, and increasingly they connect back to a phrase that appears constantly in political conversations. You've probably heard it. We're not a democracy, we're a republic. I keep hearing that over and over. And Heather Cox Richardson did a fantastic episode just the other day digging into it as well. And it's one of the more common phrases in political discourse right now. But the reality is much simpler. A republic is a form of democracy. The two concepts aren't opposites. A republic simply means citizens elect representatives to govern on their behalf. That's what we do. The core principle is the same. Political authority originates with the people, which brings me back to the central theme that is connecting everything we've discussed tonight. Every story we've talked about tonight connects to the same question. Who holds power? Who limits that power? The elections, the courts, the schools, the protests, the economy, all of it. The American system was intentionally designed around the idea that no person and no institution should hold unlimited authority. Not presidents, not Congress, not court, not corporations, nobody. Power is supposed to be distributed, balanced, questioned, limited, because the founders understood something that remains true today. Freedom depends on accountability, and accountability depends on participation. The system only works when citizens stay engaged, when we vote, when we ask questions, when we hold leaders accountable, regardless of party. That's the real story of the moment. Not outrage, not fear, not participation. Throughout American history, progress has happened when ordinary people decide democracy wasn't somebody else's responsibility. It was ours. Thank you for listening. Follow, like, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.